One of the now infamous Trump-Cohen tapes has been released. The audio recording was given to CNN by the lawyer for President Trump's ex-lawyer, Michael Cohen. CBS News has not been able to independently verify the authenticity of the tapes. And as Mola Lenghi reports, the Trump team is already disputing what was said.
I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with funding. Yes.
CNN aired a recording of a 2016 conversation between then presidential candidate Trump and Michael Cohen, his longtime fixer, discussing a payment involving former Playboy model Karen McDougal. McDougal says she had an affair with Mr. Trump more than a decade ago.
So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be...
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So no.
While Cohen's attorney claims the president says he wants to use cash for the payment, the president's lawyer provided a transcript claiming the president said, "Don't pay cash." The president's own lawyers waived attorney-client privilege, allowing the recording to be released because they say it shows he did nothing wrong. But President Trump still has questions about it. He tweeted this morning, "What kind of lawyer would tape a client? So sad. Is this a first? Never heard of it before. Why was the tape so abruptly terminated, cut, while I was presumably saying positive things?" Michael Cohen's attorney told Good Morning America that he had good reason to make the tape.
Michael Cohen has turned a corner in his life, and he's now dedicated to telling the truth to everyone, and we'll see what happens.
The FBI seized a total of 12 tapes during a raid of Cohen's home and office back in April in its investigation of whether campaign finance laws were violated. Mola Lenghi, CBS News, the White House.
Joining me now to discuss the implications of the Trump-Cohen tape is Miriam Baer. Miriam is a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, as well as a former federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. Miriam, welcome. It's so great to have you here. So President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, says no payment was made to the former Playmate Karen McDougal. This is significant, correct?
Well, I mean, this is sort of interesting. The tape, if you listen to it, is almost like catching the middle episode of one of your favorite television programs, and you didn't see the first episode of the season, and you haven't seen the finale. So you're sort of trying your best to try to figure out what already occurred and what's going to happen next.
Right. But from the tape, we don't get an indication as to whether the payment that allegedly was discussed was made, correct?
Right. So what we know from listening to the tape is that a payment has been made from AMI, which is the media company that owns the National Enquirer, or as both Michael Cohen and Trump refer to it as our friend David, which is really David Pecker. They know that he's paid money to, or I guess AMI has paid money to Karen McDougal, which is really essentially what's been reported as a sort of catch and kill program, which essentially was, we'll pay for your information, but then we're not going to run the story. Right. So that we can infer from listening to this conversation. So a payment has been made to her. What we can't know from listening to this conversation is if Michael Cohen turned around and then paid David. Right? What we hear on that tape is a discussion of possibly paying David and the means and methods that would be used to pay David. So that's where we hear Michael Cohen explaining, I'm going to have to set up a company, we're going to have to use our accountant, I've talked to the accountant, here's how it might work. But we really don't know for sure whether that payment was ever made.
Now, if there is proof unearthed that indeed the president did make a payment, would that cause legal trouble for him?
Absolutely, because it would suggest, again, and we say absolutely, it certainly would cause trouble. Now, whether it causes an actual conviction is a completely different issue. But does it cause trouble? Certainly it would cause inquiry, because it could mean that you would treat AMI's payment to Karen McDougal, if it was intended to influence the election, that's then a campaign contribution. And then if Mr. Trump reimburses that, that becomes almost like a loan. Like, hey, thanks for fronting this money. In a few months, we're going to pay you back. That's a problem if you don't disclose it.
Now, of course, all of this brings to mind a former vice presidential candidate, John Edwards, who was indeed indicted on campaign violations. Is this a similar case?
Right, and he eventually was a presidential candidate as well.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So his case is a little different in that there were questions about whether a payment to someone with whom he had had an affair, whether those payments were intended to influence his election, right? In other words, if you have just payments, you're paying off a mistress because you don't want that information to get out because you're worried that your wife will find out, that may be untoward, that may have various political issues attached to it. There may even be other legal issues attached to it, depending on how you pay it. But that's not necessarily a federal campaign violation. If, on the other hand, the payment is intended to influence an election, such as, oh my gosh, we can't let this information get out because then it will be bad for me and I'll lose the election. Well, then you have a problem with the campaign finance laws. And the difference here in this case, as it's shaping up, assuming there is a case, is that you now have two people on a tape not only discussing this problem with David, but it's all in the context, the overall context of, hey, that was a really good poll, and hey, we got to make sure that my divorce records remain sealed. In other words, they seem to be talking a lot about things that seem to matter to the election, all in the context of this conversation.
So complicated. Let's look into Michael Cohen a little bit. I mean, we know that he is under investigation by your former office.
Yes.
Do we know, first of all, do we know whether recording his client was legal? And secondly, do you know what specifically they'll be looking at Michael Cohen? And does the release of this tape indicate that he is already flipped on the president?
Right, so a lot of interesting questions here. Simply taping someone in New York, we have what's called, at least our state law, is what we call one-party consent. So I only need to consent myself to tape a conversation with you. Like, I could be, recording this without telling you. Obviously, kind of ridiculous. There are ethical issues. There are definitely legal ethical issues as an attorney to tape your client in New York, but that's sort of a different issue. With regard to Michael Cohen's investigation, I would almost speculate right now that Michael Cohen has not signed any type of cooperation with the Southern District of New York, because I would expect his attorney wouldn't have felt comfortable just simply going out to the press and saying, hey, here's this tape. Right? That's not to say, however, that his attorneys are not discussing the potential possibility of him cooperating. One problem for him with cooperating is when you cooperate with the Southern District of New York, if you are going to cooperate in a criminal case, you have to admit everything you've done. In other words, when you come in for that first meeting with the government, the prosecutors will explain to you, look, if you're going to sign up as a cooperator, you have to admit everything you've done that's wrong. Any kind of bank fraud, any kind of tax fraud, so any kind of violations that he has committed, and it could be completely unrelated to Trump, he would have to admit and be willing to plead guilty to at least the most serious crimes that he admits to. So that's a lot of work on his part. And then not only that, the government has to be assured that you're telling the truth and that you're not minimizing your own conduct. All of that takes time. So for someone like Michael Cohen, it's not just, the government just doesn't decide one day, oh, hey, let's cooperate with this guy.
Former federal prosecutor Miriam Baer, thank you so much for shedding some light on this case. Thank you.